As a Baltimore Ravens fan, should we care about the NFL MVP? Should we care if our quarterback has a legitimate chance to win it? And if his numbers and his play outperforms his contemporaries and the award goes somewhere else, should we care? I believe we should. Well, why? The Baltimore Ravens are a young franchise, only 29 years in existence. And not many franchises can say they have one MVP, much less two MVPs, but exclusively a team that has three MVPs. This is a franchise legacy award if the Ravens, Lamar Jackson, take home the MVP. This is a legacy establishing award for Lamar Jackson if he takes home the MVP. But something's happening in the national sports media where the goalposts for the MVP award is being moved. And we discuss next on the GM. Now, you guys knew that it would not be long before I got into the conversation about the NFL MVP. And part of the reason why I'm having this conversation is because the Baltimore Ravens fan base has been inundated with national sports media that have seemingly convinced us that the MVP does not matter. We've heard things like, well, Lamar Jackson would give up one of his MVPs to win a Super Bowl. I've even heard people say he'll give up both his MVPs to win a Super Bowl. And what I'll tell you is that's dumb. I'll tell you why in a second. You see, we have been convinced not to even focus on MVP, not to talk about it, not to combat it, because it pales into comparison of winning a Super Bowl. And that if Lamar Jackson wins an MVP and gets into the playoffs and doesn't perform well, then the MVP was invalidated. And that's not true. But we believe that. We've got on board with ignoring the MVP conversation and just focus on what happens in the playoffs. But what I'll tell you is the NFL MVP happens as a regular season award, and it's mutually exclusive to everything else. Why? Because each level of success has its own MVP. There is an MVP for the AFC Championship or the NFC Championship. There is a MVP for the Super Bowl. So why should we ignore as a fan base the accomplishment of an MVP when the regular season and the postseason and the Super Bowl in some ways are exclusive? But let's keep going. You see, I don't want us to ignore the MVP or the MVP conversation. In fact, I want us to pay even more attention to it. In fact, if you listen to this video right now, go ahead and hit the like button. I want as many people to hear this conversation as possible. You see, because I believe that Lamar Jackson is on pace or should be on pace to win his third MVP, but I don't think that the national sports media is going to allow him to, because that's where your MVP voting comes from. It's very, very clear that for the last 5 weeks, the NFL MVP has been handed to and talked about only in one context, and that's Josh Allen as being the winner. And I think it's a false ending. I think it's a false narrative. And I think the award was, quote unquote, decided way too soon. See, it was decided when Josh Allen had a walk-off touchdown against the Chiefs. Big moment. I do not disagree. But one moment or a couple of moments does not exclude a complete body of work. You see, the goalposts in the MVP conversation has been moved consistently, right? You've heard national sports media say, well, this year it's not about best player. And then you've heard, oh, it's not about statistics either. Right? And then as of late, as of Thursday and Friday of last week, what's the conversation about? Oh, it's about who has the narrative. And Josh Allen has the narrative. So since it's about narrative, since the MVP conversation is about narrative, then I'll talk about narrative. I will use their criteria to eliminate their arguments. You see, because the truth is you can't have a narrative without having statistics. So the MVP has to be about statistics, because what are you talking about then? See, if you're not talking about team success, that's a win-loss record. That is a statistic. See, if you're not talking about passing yards or touchdowns or passing completion or rushing yards, then you don't have anything to talk about. Why? Because those are what? Statistics. So to say it's not about statistics but about a narrative is just pretty much dumb. But let me use the narrative. Let me start out with who is supposed to be the leader. That's Josh Allen. Very, very clear that since that Kansas City game, they have handed him the award, right? And the only reason why Lamar Jackson got back into the conversation is because Lamar Jackson has been an absolute dog since the bye week, winning 3 games in dominant fashion in 11 days. That's the only reason why Lamar Jackson got back into the conversation. That's the truth. Because it was foregone that Josh Allen was the winner. And then when Lamar Jackson was winning 3 games in 11 days, Josh Allen had a letdown against the Patriots. They won, but it wasn't a good game at all. Now, this video is being recorded before Sunday's kickoff. You will see it on Monday. Part 2 will be recorded after Sunday's games. But let me get back to my conversation, narrative. So the narrative around Josh Allen really is that although his numbers are not better than other players, he's done more with less. Now, we can't get into statistics in this video because that's the second video. But that's the narrative around Josh Allen. He's done more with less. Okay? When you go to a candidate like Jared Goff, who does not get much notoriety, what's the narrative around him? Well, his 5 interception game has basically disqualified him. And it disqualified him, I believe, because when a quarterback has 5 interceptions and they still win, that speaks to the elite level of talent playing around that quarterback. And I really believe that's why Jared Goff does not have the strong notoriety right now as an MVP candidate. I think that game kind of canceled out his candidacy. But that would get into statistics. And if it's about narrative, then you can't talk about statistics. Let's go to a guy like a Saquon Barkley. Saquon Barkley, the narrative around him is that he's going to break Eric Dickerson's all-time rushing record. Well, hold it. That can't be his narrative. Why? Because if that's his narrative, that would have to include statistics. You see how their argument out of their own mouths kind of is oxymoronic? It kind of cancels itself out. Or it's not about statistics, it's about narrative. But the narrative around Saquon Barkley being an MVP candidate is if he breaks Eric Dickerson's all-time record, he should win it. That's interesting. Not statistics, but narrative. But you can't talk about one without the other. But let's go to a dark horse like Joe Burrow. I think Joe Burrow will absolutely get some MVP votes. The narrative around Joe Burrow is what? He would be the MVP. Why? Because he leads the league in passing. He leads the league in passing touchdowns. But he doesn't have the team success. Well, that's statistics. But that's a part of the narrative. And the thing is, what's been said about Joe Burrow is that he has been dragging a bad defense to victories this season. And if his defense weren't so bad, he would have more wins. And if he had more wins, he would be the MVP candidate. Or he would be the MVP. But that narrative would be validated with statistics. Here we are again with that same word. And then let's go to the reigning MVP, and that's Lamar Jackson. The narrative around Lamar Jackson is that he can't win it because he's doing great things with a stacked roster. And we can't dispute that until we get to the statistics video, right? That's really why. See, it's Lamar Jackson and Josh Allen who are the leading candidates for MVP, and Lamar Jackson has come on late, but he can't overtake Josh Allen because he has a better team. But we forget about the narrative that for the first 11 games of this season, the first 10 and a half games of this season, he had been playing with the worst pass defense in the entire league. Now, I won't give you numbers, but that's a true thing. And if you watch the Ravens like I did, you would know that's true. So let me do something to close out this conversation. I'm going to borrow something from every MVP candidate and show you how one player encompasses all the narratives. Josh Allen doing more with less, right? But Lamar Jackson has been playing with one of the worst offensive lines in the entire NFL. And yeah, numbers may say something different. That's next video, part 2. But when you watch the tape, which is what they suggest people do, national sports may say watch the tape, you would see he's making that offensive line look way better than what they are. Narrative, more or less. Okay. If we borrow Jared Goff's narrative of one game canceled out his MVP candidacy, then we will have to look at Lamar Jackson's worst game, which would be the Pittsburgh Steelers game. And Jared Goff's worst game, and they still won, versus a Lamar Jackson's worst game where they lost, would say that he didn't have a team around him to pick him up like Jared Goff. But you would have to look into statistics for that. If we borrow Saquon Barkley's candidacy, his narrative that he would break Eric Dickerson's all-time yards record and he would be the MVP. Well, something very interesting just happened to a quarterback that plays in Baltimore. He just broke the all-time rushing record for a quarterback. Sounds like all-time records, which is a statistic, is a qualifier for some players, but it doesn't get afforded to other players. That's very interesting. And then if you use Joe Burrow's narrative, Joe Burrow would be the MVP. Listen to the conversation. Would be MVP if he had a better defense. He would have more wins. But he's been dragging a bad defense all year long. Well, this real story in Baltimore is that for the first 11 weeks, this defense was trash. And Lamar Jackson still carried them to a winning record. And if you remember, 3 losses were in those first 11 games. In fact, 4 losses was in those first 11 games. But once the defense made some adjustments, we had lost since. See, so everybody's narrative that qualifies them or disqualifies them also is Lamar Jackson's narrative. You see, they made sure to say you can't use statistics and you can't say who's the best player. Well, that's dumb. Because if you're the best player, then certainly you're going to have statistics. Because statistics will validate a best player. Oh, but wait, there's one more. See, because when it's coming down to Lamar Jackson and Josh Allen, here's a narrative. That it's not about best, it's about value. And if you take Josh Allen off that team, and they wouldn't be nothing. If you take Lamar Jackson off the team, that they would still have a chance. Shut the heck up. We've seen the Baltimore Ravens without Lamar Jackson, and we've seen what they become. See, we have evidence of that. See, we have evidence that that narrative has already existed, and we've lived that out as Baltimore Ravens fans. And one dummy even tried to point to the Ravens versus the Bengals game in the playoffs a couple of years ago now, and what they about did. The abouts don't count. You see, it's so obvious how it doesn't matter who the commentator is. It's very obvious that Josh Allen is this year's pick, regardless of what the real narrative is, and regardless of what the numbers actually say. Ravens Nation, I challenge us to make more noise. Jump into the comment sections. Make some noise. Stop giving these national sports media shows your viewership and not hold them accountable for the false narrative, the hoax of a narrative that they continue to disseminate. Because you can't have an MVP narrative without MVP statistics. I'm your guy Boulanger. Stay tuned for part 2. And by all means, if you heard this late in the video, please hit the like button. Share it with a friend. I'm out.